We have spent the last season on the road, on blacktop ribbons cutting through America, on lonely shoulders, truck stops, exit ramps, and stretches of highway where people disappeared into the dark. But every road ends somewhere, at a dead end, at a lover's lane, at a quiet place just off the map where headlights go dim, engines cool, and two people think they've found a little privacy in the dark. That's where this season begins. Because not every hunter stayed on the highway. Some waited at the edge of town, in the trees, in the silence just beyond the windshield. This is Season 12 of Deadly Truths with Becca, a new branch of Interstate Highly Deadly. Last Kiss on Lover's Lane. For our first stop, we go back to 1946, Texarkana, a city caught between two states, a summer soaked in fear, and a phantom who turned moonlight romance and parked cars into the perfect hunting ground. This is the story of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, and it begins with one of the first great phantom killer cases in American history. In the early hours of March 24th, 1946, on a lonely Bowie County road outside of Texarkana, somebody came across a parked car and found the kind of scene that turns a town inside out. Inside were Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly Ann Moore, 17. Both had been shot in the back of the head with a .32 revolver. Blood on the ground suggested they had been killed outside the car and then placed back inside it, which somehow makes the whole thing even worse. Murder is bad enough. Staging it like a grotesque little afterthought is the kind of detail that tells you this was not a drunken argument gone sideways. This was colder than that. And this is the point where every old Lover's Lane story starts to blur together in people's heads. A parked car, young people out in the dark, a road just isolated enough to feel private and just remote enough to become a very bad decision in retrospect. It sounds like the setup to a campfire tale somebody's old cousin swears happened to a friend of a friend. Except this one did happen. Texarkana was not dealing with folklore. It was dealing with two real bodies and the first unmistakable sign that something predatory was moving through the edges of town. But even that is not the ugliest part, because Griffin and Moore may not have been the beginning. A month earlier, on February 22nd of 1946, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Janine Larry were parked on another secluded Bowie County road when a man approached them, armed and masked. According to later accounts, his face was hidden by a burlap sack with eye slits. That detail alone, well, that's nightmare fuel. Not elegant, not theatrical, not movie villain stylish, but it was cheap, ugly, and functional, I suppose. The kind of thing a man wears when he wants to become less human. He forced the couple out of the car, beat Hollis so badly that his skull was cracked in two places, and then he sexually assaulted Larry before fleeing when he spotted approaching headlights. Both survived, which means before Texarkana had its first double homicide, it already had two witnesses and a warning it did not yet know how to read. And that attack does change everything. Without it, the murders of Griffin and Moore could be filed, at least temporarily, under the usual lies communities tell themselves. Wrong place, wrong time, maybe a robbery, maybe it was personal, maybe it was just a one-off. People love a one-off, and a one-off lets you get back to bed. But Hollis and Larry blow the comfort straight to hell. Now, there is a pattern forming. Secluded roads, young couples, nightmares, sudden violence, and an attacker comfortable enough in the dark to walk right up to a parked car and turn privacy into a death trap. And that is what made this case stick. It wasn't just the killings, it was the setting. Lovers' lanes set in a strange corner of American memory. They are part of freedom, part of rebellion, part teenage mythology. A place where kids and young adults go to feel grown up, unsupervised, romantic, maybe reckless, but still basically safe. Not smart, maybe. Safe, supposedly. That illusion shattered on the roads outside of Texarkana. The danger was not downtown, it was not an alley, it was not something invisible in the criminal underworld. It was waiting in the dark where people went to kiss and smoke and lie to their parents about being home by 11. You gotta admit, it's pretty unfair, and that's why it lingers. Because there's something especially cruel about a killer who does not just take lives. He poisons the ritual. He turns moonlight, parked cars, and quiet back roads into things parents mourn about for the next 50 years. Congratulations to whoever that man was, I guess. He managed to become both a murderer and a permanent civic vibe problem. For Texarkana, the discovery of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore was not just a homicide investigation, it was the moment a border town began to understand that something had stepped out of the trees and it might come back. By mid-April, Texarkana could no longer pretend that Griffin and Moore, that this case was some isolated burst of violence, that it had dropped out of the sky and would politely never again. That fantasy died on April 14th, 1946. That night, Paul Martin, 16, picked up Betty Jo Booker, 15, after she had been performing at a VFW event. They were not some doomed, star-crossed couple wandering into folklore. I mean, guys, they were just kids. They were out late, doing the ordinary small-town thing. Music, a ride, a little freedom, probably the usual belief that bad things happen somewhere else. And I mean, she just got done performing at the VFW. America runs on these beliefs. It'll happen somewhere else. And of course, no teenager ever thinks something like this will happen to them. By morning, Martin was dead. His body was discovered around 6:30 a.m. near the north side of North Park Road by Spring Lake Park. He had been shot multiple times. Blood found across the road suggested movement during the attack, which made the scene feel active even after the killer was gone, as if the violence had not just happened there, but had ricocheted through it. Booker was missing at first, which in itself is just as terrifying. A body gives you grief, a search gives you dread. The search party later found Betty Jo Booker nearly 2 miles away, laying behind a tree, still clothed, with her coat unbuttoned. She had been shot twice. Her saxophone was gone and would not turn up for months. And that matters because it adds one more strange, ugly fracture to the case. Not theft in any rational sense, not a clear trophy in any proven sense, just one more object lifted out of an already deranged night, as if the killer wanted to leave confusion behind along with the bodies. And this was the moment the town's fear changed shape. The earlier attack on Hollis and Leary was horrifying. Griffin and Moore made it deadly, but Martin and Booker made it undeniable. Now there were 2 double attacks tied to secluded nighttime settings. The same caliber weapon appeared again, and no clean explanation that let anybody tuck this into a file labeled private dispute. Move on. A pattern was emerging, and patterns scare people more than chaos. Chaos is random. A pattern means somebody is choosing. This second double killing also shoved the case out of private tragedy and into public panic. Roads that had once offered privacy now looked like traps. Parents started worrying about where their kids were. Police increased patrols on isolated lanes. Rumors multiplied, because rumors always do when law enforcement has no arrest and everybody in town has an imagination. That's when a murderer starts becoming something worse than human in the public mind, not because he actually is, but because absence lets people build monsters in the dark. And that is what happened. The killer was no longer just a man who had murdered young people outside of town. He was becoming an idea, a shape, a thing people talked about in lowered voices after sunset. The newspaper would soon help give him a name, but the transformation had already started. Once a town begins checking every parked car, every rustle in the trees, every pair of headlights slowing down too long, you are no longer dealing with a simple homicide case. You are dealing with civic dread. And the worst part is this: after April 14th, nobody could honestly say they had seen the bottom of it until May 3rd of 1946. People could still tell themselves a fragile lie. Stay away from park car hideaways, skip the back roads, get home earlier, and maybe you stay off that man's list. Then someone fired through a farmhouse window, and that comforting little theory died in its chair with Virgil Starks. He was only 37 years old, sitting in his living room on a 500-acre farm northeast of Texarkana, reading the paper when shots came through a closed double window and struck him in the back of the head. No lane, no date night, no teenage scenery, just a house, lamplight, and a man minding his own business when evil decided to stop being subtle. His wife, Katie Starks, heard the glass break and saw her husband rise and collapse. She ran for the telephone, managed to ring twice, and was hit in the face from that same window. Blinded by blood, she tried to reach a pistol, failed, and bolted outside barefoot, crossing the road in the dark to find help. She finally reached a neighbor and got out the only words that mattered: Virgil's dead. She lived, and it gave investigators another shattered witness and gave the town something even worse than a body count. Proof that walls were no guarantee at all. The attack also did something the earlier crimes had not quite managed. It erased the boundary between those poor kids out there and us in here. Panic stopped being selective. It moved into kitchens and bedrooms. People started fastening windows, buying hardware, stockpiling ammunition, and sleeping armed. Merchants reportedly sold out of locks, guns, bullets, shades, almost immediately. Officers answering calls had to announce themselves loudly and visibly so frightened homeowners would not mistake them for the thing everybody feared was still moving around outside. That is when a murder investigation became a social condition. Texarkana did not merely feel unsafe, it became jumpy, armed, and half feral. This was also the point where the press-created figure of the Phantom Killer fully took hold. Not because anyone had seen a ghost, obviously, but because nobody could pin down the man. No clean suspect, no arrest that stuck, no explanation neat enough to calm anyone down. A name like that does real damage. Once the public starts describing a flesh and blood offender as something spectral, the story stops living only in police files. It starts living in imagination, where it gets taller, colder, and harder to kill. Great for headlines, terrible for your sleep. But here is where the case gets slippery, if you care about what can actually be proved. Authorities linked the farmhouse shooting to the earlier assaults at the time, yet later investigations were less certain. Reports pointed to a different weapon in the Starks attack, and by 1948, some law enforcement officials no longer considered that episode part of the same series at all. So even in the middle of the terror, the ground underneath the story was unstable. Was this one offender expanding his reach, or was Texarkana living through overlapping violence and forcing it into a single narrative because nobody has ever settled that cleanly? And that uncertainty, well, it's gasoline for a case like this. If all of it belongs together, then the hunter evolved. If part of it does not, then the town may have been hunted by more than one danger at the same time. Then came the part every frightened town usually gets: the flood of bad leads, shaky uncertainty, and one suspect who never quite went away. Law enforcement did not lack manpower. City police, county sheriffs, the Arkansas State Police, the Texas Rangers, and federal agents all touched the case. Rewards climbed, tips poured in. By late March, officers were already chasing piles of useless information, and after the April killings, the reward fund swelled even more. This all sounds so impressive until you remember what usually comes with public hysteria: weirdos, attention seekers, drunks, druggies, liars, and people who suddenly remember mentioning a strange car 3 counties over. Panic is basically a part-time job creator for nonsense. Investigators reportedly examined hundreds of possible suspects and dealt with multiple false confessions. One officer later recalled that several men admitted to being the Phantom, but their stories did not line up with the known details. I know, it's really weird, but people confess to crimes they didn't do all the time. So, because this all tells us how badly people wanted this solved, it also tells us that some of them wanted to attach themselves to the actual story. Either way, the case was getting buried under static. And once a file starts filling with junk, the real danger is not merely missing the truth, it is convincing yourself you have found it because you're exhausted enough to need a villain by Friday. Among the names that surfaced, one stuck harder than the rest, as usual. And his name was U.L. Sweeney, a career criminal tied to auto theft and forgery. He did not come to officers' attention because of some dramatic forensic breakthrough. After all, they didn't really have a lot of forensics back then. He emerged while police were working stolen car angles and realized a vehicle had vanished around the same time of one of the attacks. Arkansas State Police investigator Max Tackett followed the trail, arrested Sweeney's wife, Peggy, and then the case took a stranger turn. Peggy gave a detailed statement saying her husband had committed the crimes, particularly the Martin Booker killings. According to later accounts, she described facts police believed a random outsider should not have known, including where certain belongings had been discarded. This is where things get ugly, in the most unsatisfying way possible. There was smoke, but not enough fire for court. Peggy's story shifted in some places. Investigators suspected she was frightened of Sweeney or worried about implicating herself, and eventually she recanted. Worse for prosecutors, she could not be compelled to testify against her husband. Yes, that's a law. That gutted the murder case. Officers spent months trying to firm up her claims with independent cooperation, and 2 major investigators later believed Sweeney was responsible. But belief is not conviction, and suspicion is not proof. True crime lives in that gap. Real courtrooms, they do not. There was also circumstantial material that kept dragging his name back into the frame. There was reports that his wife possessed a car that was linked to the timeline of one of the killings. He made statements suggesting that he feared being executed, claims that he had sold a .32 Colt automatic, and details connecting him to items or locations relevant to the inquiry. Some of that has been repeated for decades in books and retellings, but even taken together, it never crossed the line into murder prosecution. Instead, Sweeney went to prison on habitual offender auto theft charges. So the man many officers came to view as their best answer did time, just not for the thing that made him infamous, which is either grimly efficient or deeply maddening, depending on how much faith you still have in the system by this point of the story. And that leaves Texarkana in the exact place old cases become immortal. Not with certainty, but with residue. Sweeney may well have been the killer. He is still the likeliest name attached to the file, yet those murders were never cleared in the clean official sense that most of us want. No courtroom ending, no final public reckoning, just a suspect, a frightened wife, a ruined spring, and decades of people staring at the same hole in the middle of the record and deciding for themselves what belongs there. What probably happened is not the same thing as what can be proved, and Texarkana has been stuck inside that distinction since 1946. If you look strictly at the core cluster, the February 22nd assault on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Janine Larry, the March 24th killings of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, and the April 15th murders of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, the similarities, well, you can't ignore them. Young couples, nighttime, remote areas used for privacy, sudden violence with little warning, and those first three incidents, investigators and later writers have generally treated them as the same offender theory, as the strongest explanation. That is the spine of the Phantom story, and it is why the case still lands to this day. The pattern feels deliberate, predatory, and intimate in all the wrong ways. So when people say they knew who did it, that is too tidy. A better way to put it is this. Many investigators thought they had their man, but the record never closed around him tightly enough to end the argument. And that leaves the ending where the best old cases usually live, somewhere between history and a nightmare. Officially, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders remain unsolved today. Unofficially, most people who spend time with the case end up circling right back to Sweeney. The attacks inspired later films, annual local rituals, and the broader American image of Lover's Lane as a place where privacy can curdle into danger. That is the real afterlife of this case, not just 5 dead, young people and a suspect who slipped the noose, but a permanent corruption of a setting that once meant freedom. Moonlight, a parked car, rode just outside of town. After Texarkana's things no longer belonged only to young people. They belonged to the story, too. What turned Texarkana into the town that dreaded sundown was not only the killings, it was the way that fear spread faster than evidence. After the April murders of Paul Martin and Betty Jo, the public mood changed from shock to pattern recognition. These were not people being told to worry in theory. They were watching young locals die in places everybody knew, on roads everyone had driven, under conditions everyone understood. Local businesses began observing curfews, and Booker's high school even ended classes early so students could attend the funerals. That is when homicide stops being news and starts becoming atmosphere. The newspapers helped harden the atmosphere into something mythic. Local media began using the name Phantom Killer, and once that happened, the offender stopped sounding like a man and started sounding like a force. And that kind of label, it lifts the case out of the ordinary criminal language and turns it into folklore, while the investigation is still warm. When I was a kid, I heard about this, but I didn't think it was true. I just thought it was an urban tale. The title, The Moonlight Murders, was also press-made frame, which helped package the crimes as something cinematic, something sinister, instead of what they were, a series of clumsy, brutal attacks by someone with a gun and a lot of opportunity. After the Virgil Stark shooting, the panic widened from that dating spot to private homes, and media coverage, of course, intensified. And the Texarkana Gazette warned readers the killer might strike again at any moment, at any place, and at anyone, according to later summaries of the reporting. And rumors multiplied. Some residents became convinced the slayer had already been caught and was being secretly held. Others suspected their neighbors, of course any strangers, and anyone acting remotely off. One young woman reportedly aimed a pistol at an officer until he identified himself. Another case involved police chasing a suspicious driver and shooting out his tires, only to learn he was a local high school athlete who thought he was being followed by someone suspicious himself. In other words, once panic took over this town, practically everyone became a supporting actor in the same bad, scary movie. And it's important to know the geography of this place. The split city structure made everything messier. Texarkana was and is 2 municipalities across 2 states, which meant overlapping jurisdictions. And for those of you who are not familiar with that area, it sits right between Texas and Arkansas, hence the Texarkana. Talking about the afterlife, in 1976, the town that dreaded sundown turned the case into one of the earliest slasher-adjacent cult films based only loosely on those real attacks. The movie made the Phantom even less human and more iconic, which is usually what popular culture does to unresolved violence. It has to sand down the uncertainty and sell back that fear. That film's legacy lasted long after the original investigation cooled, and it helped freeze those murders into American horror memory, rather than leaving them as regional post-war crimes. And it is frightening, the idea that violence infected a setting, mood, even a time of day. The murders did not just leave bodies behind, they contaminated twilight. They made parked cars feel exposed, made quiet roads feel staged, made the ordinary act of being out after dark feel like volunteering for somebody else's plan. That is the real legacy here. The killer may never have been properly nailed down, but the fear absolutely was. What the Phantom left behind was not closure. It was damage with no proper ending. What do we do with all of this? 5 people were killed, 3 survived. An entire city changed its behavior, and one spring in Texarkana became something heavier than history. It became folklore with a body count. That is what the Phantom left behind. This was the last kiss on Lover's Lane. No courtroom reckoning, no final confession that settled everything, no single moment where fear was marched into the open and given a name that stuck hard enough to kill the legend. Instead, what remained was worse: uncertainty. If this episode stays with you, do me a favor, follow, rate, review Deadly Truths with Becca wherever you listen or watch. Ratings matter more than most people realize. They help more listeners find the show, and they keep these stories alive. And if you know someone who loves true crime, unsolved cases, and the darker side of American history, share this episode with them. This is Deadly Truths with Becca. And remember, the past is not dead. It's just parked at the edge of town after dark.